big hello to everyone. And thank you for joining us this evening to listen to a fascinating talk, I think, in our series on Let's Talk Climate Change. My name is Harini Nagendra. I'm from Azim Premji University, and I lead the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability at the university, where we focus on issues relevant to climate change, the environment, human relationships with the environment, and a large canvas of things that covers. As one of the focus areas of the university and indeed the foundation, so the university is part of Azim Premji Foundation, which has a deep interest in sustainability for a very long time. And as one of the things that which form our mission is to do climate communication and communication on the environment to outside audiences and to public audiences. And so we've had a long and successful partnership with Bangalore International Center. This is one of the things that we do at BIC every year. So at least once a month, once in 2 months, we have a Let's Talk Climate Change series. And we've had a number of wonderful people come and talk at this. Please check out the YouTube channel of the university and of BIC, where you'll see the older talks. For instance, Professor Mahesh Rangarajan from Ashoka University started us off with a talk on the Anthropocene. We've had a number of wonderful speakers. Ruth de Vries from Columbia University has spoken about millets and their importance to India's sustainability transitions. Jaya Sundi has spoken about renewable energy in India. So you can look at these old talks on YouTube. It's a great pleasure for me specifically to introduce an old friend, colleague, and someone whose work I admire very highly, Rohan Arthur. Rohan Arthur is from Nature Conservation Foundation, Mysore, and in fact is one of the founders. They set up this organization about 25 years ago, and he's been working in the islands of Lakshadweep as a marine ecologist for the past 25 years. Rohan is someone we've been trying to get for a while, and he spends a lot of time in the islands. So it's good to have him here finally for the talk. And because all of us know about the issues of, I think, of environment and coral reefs and why coral reefs are such a fragile embodiment of climate change. And as Rohan has been working on these coral reefs of Lakshadweep and indeed on coral reefs across the world in a number of different contexts, we thought it would be wonderful for him to come and talk about his work and what does this tell us about climate change and human attempts to deal with climate change and indeed to survive alongside the environment. So Rohan, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and over to you.
First up, I would like to thank Azim Premji University and Dr. Harini Nagendran for inviting me to give this talk, and to Bangalore International Center for hosting it. And I would like to thank you all as well for coming. If some of you have heard small sections of this talk before, I hope that you'll bear with me. I guess I'm hoping that with sufficient repetition, I may get some clarity myself about what I'm trying to say. Also, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge a subset of people who have accompanied me on some of these journeys that I will be talking about, not least the people of Lakshadweep, without whom none of this thinking would have been possible. I work with the Nature Conservation Foundation, and that's a badly sketched logo of the Nature Conservation Foundation, where I work. I'm sure most of you recognize it as the Pashupati seal from Mohenjo-daro. It has a proto-Shiva sitting amidst a whole bunch of animals, both wild as well as domestic, as well as representations of humans. And for us in NCF, it represents the kind of joint flourishing we would like to see between humans and nature. So about 25, 26 years ago now, when we were actually choosing the seal, there was a contender for the seal which I really pushed for, and it was this. It was, it was a dung beetle pushing a ball shaped like the earth up a conservation slope, much like Sisyphus, knowing exactly how futile his endeavor was. And for me, this captured the perfect balance between humility and hubris, right? That has characterized the conservation movement over the last several decades. At NCF, I have seen up close what it is like to do conservation research and action in the real world, and the increasingly urgent need to do it. But speaking about conservation at the scale of an entire continent, or certainly of the world, is much too big a task for me. So instead, what I'll do is speak very, very briefly from my own experience of the conservation crisis over the last quarter of a century, from a perch that is only a few meters above sea level, from where I've seen this crisis unfolding. And some of you have seen this as well, been to these places along with me as well. Since 1996, I have worked in the tiny coral archipelago of Lakshadweep. Okay. The archipelago itself is part of a submarine ridge that stretches from Chagos south to Maldives and then finally to the Lakshadweep. This chain of coral atolls was born, I'm sure some of you know, in the Reunion hotspot. And it was born in the Reunion hotspot, and as the Indian subcontinent moved to hit the Asian plate, it dragged this entire coral atoll chain along with it, and that's how you get the Lakshadweep being born. The Lakshadweep is the oldest among this entire chain of atolls, with Chagos being the youngest. So that's what the Lakshadweep looks like when you fly over it. Okay, it's a chain of 12 atolls that enclose these shallow lagoons, and you'll see it's surrounded by this garland of white, and those are essentially the coral reefs itself, which protect the islands inside. So you have a shallow lagoon, which is extremely very calm and very protected, and then you have the open ocean on the outside. The islands have there are about 32 islands in the archipelago, but only 10 of them are inhabited. The rest of them are really small, or they don't have fresh water, and as a result, for one reason or another, they're not inhabited. Now, they look like idyllic coral paradises, the kind that you'd expect in a postcard, but the actual truth is that they're very densely populated. Okay, they have 32 square kilometers, but they have 70,000 people living on them, making them among the densest parts of rural India, and many of these locations are rapidly urbanizing. Fishing is the mainstay of the economy. Most of the economy is based largely on fishing. That is changing, but fishing continues to be an important part of the economy. And at least in the 1990s and 2000s, the fishing was largely for pelagic tuna, which means fish from the outside. They were not fishing on the reef as much, but fishing for pelagic tuna. And fishing on the reef was actually fairly light. So the outer reefs have dense and diverse coral reefs. These are really among the most beautiful coral reefs that I've ever seen. And from the very first time that I dived here, I was absolutely fascinated. So I first came here in 1996, and the reefs that I saw were among the most beautiful and stunning reefs that I've ever seen anywhere. Of course, over the last 3 decades, these reefs have been subject to significant declines as a result of repeated El Nino events. And I'm sure many of you have heard about what El Nino events do to coral reefs. And this is a picture of exactly that same reef that I showed you earlier, but significantly bleached, a phenomenon called bleaching. Okay, and this has been happening over the last 20 or 30 years through subsequent El Nino events. And as a result, the Lakshadweep has become, in many ways, a poster child of the climate crisis in India. It is one of the places that is most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And I have worked all my life on these islands, and from this very low perch, I have grappled with the crisis of conservation that these islands face. And frankly, and this is what I want to talk to you about today, it worries me that nothing I have done in these last 25 years rises to the scale of the problem of climate change. And it worries me that nothing that I've done over these 25 years can actually help address the problems that we are seeing in these islands. It has made me wonder about conservation as a discipline itself. So I should say before I start that these are a bunch of hastily penciled thoughts, and this is really about the start of a conversation that I want to have rather than fully formed ideas. So don't take anything that I'm saying, anything more than half-formed thoughts. This is the alternate title for my talk. Okay, the image I have in my head is that of a train hurtling out of control. The crazy motormen of neoliberal capitalism are just in the engine room, shoveling increasing quantities of coal, as the train is accelerating to some kind of inescapable doom. And from we're running out of track, and the train is accelerating. And from our various compartments, we conservationists, are all shouting above the noise of the engine to try to stop the train in its tracks, or at least reduce its speed. Okay. I see myself sitting in the very last wagon of the train, what they call the caboose, I think, in the US, and what we call the brake van. And I'm shocked and aghast at what I see, but I have very little agency to do much about it. And when we speak of nature today, we often talk about it in these terms, as a rapidly accelerating crisis of immense proportions that is likely to be infinitely catastrophic. All of us, when we think about nature and the nature crisis, that's the way we think about it. And this goes back really to conservation as a discipline. Since its inception, conservation has been a discipline of crisis. Okay? So writing about a decade before NCF was set up, Michael Soule, who was really the founder of conservation as a subject of study, he laid out a powerful manifesto for conservation. He insisted that it was an unapologetically mission-driven discipline, one that was interested not so much in the accrual of knowledge as in the delivery of results, right? So he said that it is to ecology what war is to political science, right? Or what surgery is to physiology. Of course, you need to understand physiology, but on the operating table, your physiology is not going to help. You need to work with what's there in front of you. The biodiversity crisis, Soule says, does not give us the luxury of time to unpick all the causal links between anthropogenic impact and biodiversity loss. So we have to work with what we have. Aldo Leopold, that other great thinker of ecology, he said that the first rule of intelligent tinkering is to keep all the pieces. So you can tinker all you want, but just keep all the pieces. So this then is the primary mandate of conservation. Make sure you keep all the cogs and wheels. You can figure out about where they fit and what function they have later on. First, let's staunch the self-evident loss before we can figure out exactly what's causing the gaping wound in the first place. Against that, of course, against Soule's calls to arms, we should probably keep Daniel Webster's wise warning in mind as well, that a strong conviction that something must be done is the parent to many bad measures. But having said that, I mean, the crisis is self-evident, right? It is all around us. Everywhere we go, we see habitats ravaged by development. We see expansions of townships, encroachments by local communities. We hear of species declining as they are hunted or fished to extinction, or as ecosystems shrink. At NCF, we've predominantly been concerned with the biodiversity crisis, and we've tried to address it in our different geographies, either by working with local communities to spare wildlife, to reducing conflict in shared spaces, or with various attempts at restoring wild nature. But if the biodiversity crisis was bad, the climate crisis is, if anything, even worse. Okay? At least with the biodiversity crisis, our enemies were clear. Okay? We knew who the enemies were with the biodiversity crisis. It was the illegal hunter, or the fisher, or the logger, right? The cement company, or the oil tanker, etc. These were the clear villains of the piece, and we just knew exactly how to deal with them. With the climate crisis, it is humanity itself, with its insatiable greed, that is the problem, right? And the enemy is us, and our toxins are everywhere. Our villainy is merely living. That exactly is what the climate crisis tells us. So there are no places that are free of the human stain. So it is really us as humans, just by living, causing a human stain. And this human stain fills the planet. There are no places free of this. There's the National Geographic, which has an ongoing project called the Pristine Seas. And its express aim is to discover those last remaining wild areas in the world. They mount large expeditions to far-flung corners of the ocean, to the Line Islands and elsewhere in the Pacific or in Antarctic waters, to document what they find and to use this information to convince governments to protect these sacred locations. Right? These waters are teeming with sharks. If you go down there, they're teeming with all the top predators that you don't find anywhere else. But even here, in the most inhospitable places of the earth or most isolated parts of the world, researchers are finding signs of the human presence. There is no farther afield that we can go. The human stain is everywhere. The wilds are clearly in peril from brutish humanity. The conservation goal then is clear. What we need to do is to erase or at least lighten the human stain on the planet. And as a community of practitioners, we have evolved a pretty large toolbox with which to do this. We fight for protected area networks. So we want more than 30% of the planet, okay, within some form of protection by 2030. That's actually an incredible goal. It's 30% by 2030. Based on detailed population estimates and models, we establish resource extraction limits on wild resources. We deploy enforcement agencies to curb hunting and trading in wild species. We lovingly restore our degraded ecosystems and reintroduce species that once roamed there. And the list goes on. This is an incredible toolbox that we have for conservation. And it goes from the pragmatic to the painstaking to the absolutely preposterous, okay, where you have climate engineering and genetic engineering of species as solutions to the climate crisis and to the biodiversity crisis. My first experience with climate change, first when it came home to me, was I was on a remote coral atoll in Lamu Island in Kenya. And we were surveying a reef that had not been visited for many, many years. And in some of the clearest waters that I have dived in, I encountered a bleached reef for the very first time. All around, the coral were completely dying. All these bright coral were turning a strange kind of blue. Okay, we called it Smurf blue. Okay, and we knew that something was wrong because everywhere it looked the same. We came up from the dive. All of us knew that something large was happening, but I think none of us would know exactly how big it would be and how it would change coral reefs around the world. So I came back to India to survey Indian reefs. Mother was there on some of those surveys with me. The Lakshadweep was the worst hit. And in every reef I visited, the coral was bleached or dying. Now, just to give you a sense, I mean, bleaching is the result of the breakdown of a symbiotic relationship that coral have with a dinoflagellate, with a photosynthetic dinoflagellate. It's an extremely successful relationship which allows the coral to get most of its nutrition from photosynthesis. So even though it's an animal, it gets 90% or 95% of its food from photosynthesis because of this relationship. But it's a very finicky one, and if temperatures go just slightly higher, that relationship breaks down in a phenomenon called bleaching. The algae leaves, the coral turns white, and if the stress continues for a long time, the coral essentially dies of hunger. So it's essentially a heat, as a result of heat, the coral dies of hunger, 2 or 3 weeks, right? So within a few months, the reefs were a complete mass graveyard of coral. So this was 1998, and in the years that followed, the complex, beautiful architecture of the reef was completely flattened by every monsoon. So where I'd seen these really complex coral reefs everywhere with all their diverse fish diversity, were virtually going everywhere. So I'm sure if you've been reading and following much of this, about what's happening to the world's coral reefs, this is a story that you probably have heard before. It's very familiar to us. Very briefly, over the last 2 decades, we have been tracking change in these reefs. And this is the overall pattern, with plenty of nuance that I won't actually discuss over here. So on the axis, you see what I've drawn, the live coral cover, and that's 1998, where you had that major drop in coral. What is useful to point out is that in the first decade after 1998, corals of the Lakshadweep showed a significant amount of resilience, actually. They bounced back more than I could ever imagine that they would, right? So the same was true of fish communities. Fish communities they were affected for a little bit, but they actually came back really well, much, much better than I ever expected. And for a while, I actually thought that the reefs of the Lakshadweep would buck the trend of the rest of the world, because in the rest of the world, the reefs were doing really badly. So I thought Lakshadweep was going to do the same as well. I have argued that a large part of the resilience of the reefs was actually due to the fairly light fishing pressure that the Lakshadweep reefs have had, because most of the fishing was for tuna out in the open ocean, and as a result, the reef had a significant amount of resilience and was able to bounce back. So, however, subsequent disturbance events proved me wrong. And as these events became more frequent and more intense, the reef is ratcheting down without enough time to recover from the previous disturbance. This year, 2023, also threatens to be one of the largest El Nino years, and it remains to be seen how the reefs of the Lakshadweep are going to fare in relation to this. So I'm waiting to get into the field right now so that I can see, with all the enthusiasm, as I keep telling people, often undertaker measuring a corpse. Okay, because that's exactly what it feels like. The patterns, this is a graph which shows you the patterns in live coral cover. They're complex, they vary between islands, and they vary between locations as well. So I showed you that one very broad, penciled out pattern, but of course it's a little bit more complex than that. And all those lines going up and down are essentially just simple live coral cover. But simple live coral cover is much, much more nuanced, because coral are a very diverse community. And so there are lots and lots of coral, and all of them behave slightly differently. So one thing that you can possibly do is to actually look at the different kinds of corals that there are. You have corals that are weedy, you have corals that are stress tolerant, that are competitive coral. So what we did was we tried to unpack some of those patterns that were happening under those lines, to try to see whether the way these corals behave in terms of their life history had anything to do with their long-term fates. As you can see, there are lots of stress-tolerant coral in the Lakshadweep, which means that they should actually be doing much, much better. But when I try to see if they showed similar responses, what you find is that they actually don't. Forget this tree over here, but basically what it tells you is that if you look at where the various colors of the coral are distributed, they're all over the shelf. So what that tells you is that the life history of the coral has very little to do with the fate of the coral. So there's a lot that's happening over here, a very complex interaction of local geography, coral adaptive capacity, and resistance, which seems to determine these long-term responses. Okay? And there's a lot that we still don't know. So it's not as though the fate of the coral reefs are written in stone. Every location is showing something different, and what we know about the biology of coral is certainly not enough to tell us about how it's going to fare. So meanwhile, the coral reef community has also evolved. So when the first major pan-tropical mass bleaching event occurred, there were some that predicted that that the coral reefs would cease to exist in any functional way by 2050. At first, these voices were laughed at as mere doomsayers. These were, time has shown that in 1998, however, the world lost nearly 8% of all coral reefs in just that 1 year. And between 2009 and 2018, live coral cover on reefs declined by a further 13.5%. So we are losing these old ecosystems very, very rapidly, much, much more rapidly than we can imagine. Within the first decade of 1998, it became increasingly clear that those initial warnings may actually be true, that coral reefs, as we know them, may cease to exist by 2050. Understanding coral resilience became the need of the hour. I mean, can we actually find pockets of resilience? Can we find ways for reefs to actually resist this? Were there reefs that were actually resisting the temperature stress? Could this be something that coral may just get used to? If they're subjected to repeated temperature events, can they get used to it? And we found that there did seem to be some elements of where the coral reef was able to resist this temperature stress. And when people were beginning to see that conditions were getting more and more desperate, people started using other kinds of means. For instance, restoration. Once coral restoration was considered to be, just a pie in the sky kind of idea. It's very, very difficult to get coral to reproduce. It's very difficult to get them to grow. You can have restoration efforts at very, very small levels, but increasingly, more and more researchers began to think that restoration is perhaps one of the few ways that we can actually get to save the coral reefs of the world. And so from being a very marginal idea, it began to become a much, much more important idea. As we came to understand the physiology of bleaching better, it became clear that it was much more complex than we first imagined. And some corals could not just adapt, but also pass on their tolerance in their immediate vicinity, right? So corals have this relationship with zooxanthellae. What we are finding now is that these little dinoflagellates that I talked about, they come in a whole lot of varieties. Some of them are more resistant to temperature, some are less resistant to temperature. And what is possible is for coral to actually switch from one of these dinoflagellates to the other, and then you have resistant coral that actually manage to survive these temperatures, and then they can potentially even infect corals around them with these resistant zooxanthellae. So there are really interesting things that are emerging about this first dismal picture of our reefs dying, to signs that this may not be the full picture. Still others in the University of Hawaii have been going even further lengths. They've been genetically engineering heat-resistant supercoral that may someday be translocated to handle climate change. Okay, so they've been taking coral, they've been actually looking at the planulae, they've been genetically modifying them and trying to create coral that will potentially resist this new climate regime. Okay, where temperatures are going to increase, but we'll have coral that can survive them because they're genetically tolerant to them. Still other seemingly harebrained schemes are out there as well, and they're being seriously discussed in some places. For instance, cloud seeding at times when there's a lot of temperature stress, or shading large parts of reefs with large tarpaulins or things like that to bring the temperatures down. So these look like really crazy ideas, particularly when you see how big reefs are. Okay, but they're actually being considered out there in fora that are not just backroom fora. So the field has moved from despair to a kind of desperate optimism within the span of 2 decades. And the sum result is this: if brutish humanity has brought coral reefs to the brink, human ingenuity and a bit of engineering will fix the problem. And that seems to be the broad direction that we have been taking. For the reefs of the Lakshadweep, I have my doubts that any of these large engineering solutions will work. If we have to find resilience in these reefs, they will have to come from elsewhere. Most atolls are going to have a hard time surviving the century. We know this, not just for the Lakshadweep, we know this for around the world. The habitability of atolls is dependent completely on that fringe of waves that I was telling you about, where the reef is, right? And that fringe there makes the lagoon extremely calm, and the area beyond that, you can have really stormy conditions. But as long as you have growing reefs, okay, you have conditions underneath that keep within the lagoon that keep it habitable, right? And the work we've been doing recently is showing that between sea level rise and repeated El Nino events, this integrity of those reef frameworks, those outer ramparts itself, is being compromised right now. So we've been measuring something called reef accretion potential, which is essentially the ability of reefs to keep growing. Now you can think of reefs as cement factories. They're essentially producing cement, calcium carbonate, in the form called aragonite. And as long as you keep this cement factory open, you're fine. That the reef continues to grow, and the atolls behind them, the atoll islands behind them, remain habitable. As long as that cement factory closes, you're going to start having problems. Erosional factors start taking over. We have been measuring that ability, the ability of that cement factory to remain open. And if these are 3 islands that we measured it on, and that line up there tells you what is approximately the optimal conditions for that cement factory to be producing. When we measured this across these islands, what you see is that for pretty much all the places that we measured them, the ability of the reef to produce calcium carbonate is below the optimal. More worrying, for the capital city, which is Kavaratti, which houses the population of something like 13,000 people, the net rates of carbonate production are already negative for many reefs. And so this doesn't bode well at all for the reefs of the Lakshadweep and for the habitability of the islands. So this is what is happening to the outer reef itself. The outer reef itself is crumbling. And over the last few years, at the same time, I told you about the tuna fishing that was keeping the reef relatively healthy. What's happening now is that fishermen are beginning to fish the reefs as well. So there's an uncontrolled reef fishing that has begun on the reefs, where predatory fish and herbivores are being fished out of the reef in large numbers. And these are extremely important to maintain the resilience of the reef, and they are actually being taken out. Most of that, when we looked at where this fish is going, we found that most of it, nearly 80% of it, was going to the mainland market. Very little of it was actually being consumed locally. Okay? So the inherent resilience of the reef that the fish provided, that I documented about a decade ago, is now being rapidly undercut. Alongside with that, we have the developmental imaginations of the Indian state. It has big dreams for the Lakshadweep. Okay? As it sees it cashing in on high-end tourism. This should be the next Maldives, right? And so, despite our best efforts, many of these plans are continuing apace. In the next few years, if this has its way, we will see lagoon villas and seaplanes all over the Lakshadweep, designed for tourists to dive on what would essentially be dead reefs. But that's the plan. I've been at this now for 25 years or more. And over the last 25 years, I have used almost every synonym of disaster and urgency to describe this challenge of conservation for the reefs of Lakshadweep. Yes, yet if I'm absolutely honest, we have managed to make very little difference, which is what I said right at the start. Because if I turn now to that conservation toolbox, I wonder which of this buffet of options would honestly work at the spatial and temporal scales necessary to save the reefs of the Lakshadweep. There's a lot of recent attention on protected areas as countries fall over each other because they have to meet global commitments. Everyone's trying to set up marine protected areas. Okay, and while marine protected areas are going to be useful, they probably wouldn't save this set of islands. Okay, they're certainly not when it comes to climate change. It's very difficult to establish marine protected areas against the forces of climate change. And while there are small attempts at ecological restoration taking place even in the Lakshadweep, they are typically so minuscule in scale that they are unlikely to make a difference. What's left are the tools at what I call the preposterous end of the spectrum. And I don't even dare to say their name just in case some enthusiastic entrepreneur thinks that it is actually a viable solution. So each time I step off the boat now to dive on the reefs of Lakshadweep, I no longer have the same sense of wonder that I had when I first went there. What has replaced it is a sense of foreboding and anxiety. Will this year be a beaching year? I keep thinking. Will ancient stalwarts like these succumb to the next heat wave? This is a coral that is about 600 or 700 years old, and it bleached completely one year in 2016. And I had my heart in my mouth when I saw this, because I thought that as we're going to lose this large individual. Thankfully, it survived, but I'm not sure if it'll survive the next bleaching event. Will some large cyclone have broken the reef to bits? Because cyclones are increasing now in their intensity as well. Will overfishing have emptied the reef of whatever fish were left? Okay. Will the reefs be overrun by macroalgae or cyanobacteria, which is becoming increasingly common in these reefs? So each time I go down now into these reefs, what I have is a sense of foreboding and anxiety. Every time I see a small coral recruit, that's a small coral recruit that could be just about 1 or 2 years old. I cannot help but swim up to it and say a small silent prayer, in the hope that it will grow up and take over the reef along with thousands of its cohorts. So I know exactly what I'm looking for when I go up to these little corals. I'm hoping that by some miracle that I do not fully understand, the reefs are going to sort of magically return to the way I knew them in 1996 when I first saw them. The reef has surprised me in the past. Potentially, it has ways to surprise me in the future as well. So that's where we stand. And yet, of late, I'm beginning to wonder if I've got this whole thing wrong, right? I know, even as I hope for a return to some kind of prelapsarian dream, some dream of the past, that reef does not exist. It's a reef of my imagination. It's never going to come back, right? It never will, not in my lifetime, not in many lifetimes. And holding on to that hope keeps me in a state of doom or false optimism, right? I think there's something profoundly unhelpful about being stuck forever in a mode of crisis. It doesn't help, okay? Maintaining a sense of crisis for a quarter of a century is neither feasible nor does it achieve much. At least for me in the Lakshadweep, it hasn't achieved much at all. So what I'm suggesting is that we actually reframe the conservation problem. As long as we continue to think of the conservation problem as wild nature versus brutish humanity, I think it'll continue to play into our savior complexes, okay, of conservation biology. If, as Sule insists, that this is a mission-driven discipline, what are we? We are its maverick missionaries fighting, on the side of wild nature against brutish humanity, against ourselves to some extent. We are either the fire and brimstone evangelists preaching our eschatological revelations to the rest of our benighted brethren, or we are superheroes and saviors. Okay, here with our engineering solutions and our conservation utility belts that will bring the world back from the brink. Okay, neither direction, either the evangelist nor the superhero, has helped much. Okay, at least not at the scales at which we require them. So while I'm not for once suggesting that there is not a crisis at hand, I think we need to step back from being in crisis mode all the time. If I look at the Lakshadweep from the distance of about a quarter of a century, and in the light of everything that is unfolding there, I realize that it is not really the coral reef that is in crisis. The crisis, I think, lies in in the special entangled relationship of people that people have had in the Lakshadweep with their land, their fresh water, and the seas around them. It is something that I have taken for granted for the last 2 decades. But in the last few years, it is becoming increasingly clear that this entangled relationship has served Lakshadweep well since it was first inhabited about 800 years ago. If I documented any resilience in the reefs of the Lakshadweep in the first 10 years when I studied them, it lay as much in the unique relationship that people in the Lakshadweep had with their water, with their land, with their seas, as it was in the reef itself. That relationship, as Suri and I have been discussing over the last several years, is based on an acknowledgement of a certain bounded nature, one that was characterized by a whole bunch of internal feedbacks that limited unbridled exploitation. This integrity of that relationship is now clearly at risk. Between climate change and developmental agendas of the Indian state, the safe space for Lakshadweep is clearly diminishing. What was once a deeply embedded relationship of society and nature is being picked apart, and the bounds are being strained. And when those bounds are broken, then we're in territory which is very, very dangerous. This, I think, is the real crisis, this process of disembedding. And if I look around, this is common. I mean, this dynamic and embedded relationship that society has had with nature through the ages is unraveling everywhere we look. I mean, fishers, herders, gleaners, hunters, farmers, all these represent humanity's deep entanglement with nature. It is easy, of course, to romanticize these relationships, and I with land and with sea, and I don't suggest that we do. But in many of the areas we work with, these interactions remain strong, and I think we need to strengthen them. In fact, as conservationists, we have sometimes been complicit in contributing to destroying these relationships. So while we've been actively advocating biophilia, we believe that we need to advocate a love for nature as a way to restore humanity's relationship with it. We strangely seem to privilege some forms of relationships over others. So somehow we believe that the sustainable ecotourist on a jeep safari or on a Discover scuba dive has a stronger relationship to nature than a medicinal plant collector or a fisherman. We get back to crisis management. By its definition, it is meant to be makeshift. It is a high-octane solution to put out occasional fires. It works with incomplete information and it works with haste. It works with the principle of triage. It is in a war zone, you cannot save every leg, you cannot bandage every wound, you have to tackle the urgent, the necessary can wait. By adopting a crisis management as our principal mode of action, however, all we have managed to do in the last 35 years of conservation is to address small problems and to put out tiny fires. It wasn't designed, I don't think, to handle systemic issues. As a discipline, it wasn't designed like that. And what I am suggesting is that the necessary cannot wait any longer before we continue to tackle the urgent. We need to actually tackle the necessary as well. And what I suggest is that we give up these antediluvian dreams of ecosystems as they once were. Our baselines have shifted, sure, our ecosystems are going to become more mediocre, but they have been shifting for a very long time. As far back as the agricultural revolution, if you want, 12,000 years ago. So setting baselines, I think, is useful, but those baselines, I argue, need to be in a shared future, not in any past, in some kind of a pristine past. And what we need to do then is to establish a bunch of functional minimums below which serious threshold effects start taking hold in ecosystems, society, as well as in politics. So to some extent, this may seem like abandoning of hope and a betrayal of the conservation cause, but I really don't think it is. I mean, our ecosystems they're going to become worse than they are. They are going to decline in function, but that's a reality we just have to live with. I mean, I have to live with that reality every time I go to the Lakshadweep. The reefs of the Lakshadweep are certainly becoming functionally poorer. But we can sail the seas looking for pristine wildernesses to fence, But that's not going to take us very far. For the rest of the world's ecosystems, outside that little 1% of those pristine environments, they're outside. Those belong to some kind of mythic dream of paradise. And I think for the rest of the world, we need to find more practical ways forward. We need to establish just how much our shared social ecological systems can take before they completely collapse. And I think those shared social ecological systems still have resilience in them. They probably just don't look like the way we want them to look, but they still have that resilience. And I think that if we can establish what those points of inflection are, we will give ourselves a bit of time. And I think framed like this, it would help us move forward, okay, to identify what those functional thresholds are, both for ecosystems, but also societies. Okay? So the question I ask myself is this: what if we just didn't have 3 years to solve the conservation problem? What if we had 25? Or if we had 30? Okay, what would we doing different if we said that we have up to 2050 to address some of the systemic problems that our ecosystems face? So I don't say that I have the sufficient imagination to know exactly what we would do, but that's a conversation that I'd like to start. I mean, for a start, I suspect that we would not be investing as much time in desperate engineering solutions, at least as the first port of call. We need to have them there, but they shouldn't be the first thing that we go to. So for a start, if we have the luxury of a generation, can we step back and think more clearly about what makes our social ecological systems tick in the first place? Can we figure out what makes them work? So we've spent most of our time as conservation scientists thinking about this box, which is ecological dynamics, because that's what we've been trained to do. We've been trained to look at ecosystems. We've been trained to look at how species behave. So let's look at ecological dynamics. If we know how this works, okay, then that's what we know how to fix it, okay? But ecosystems rarely exist in vacuums. They are always sites of derived function, complex societal relationships, human aspirations, and individual identities. Now, David Harvey, one of the foremost contemporary interpreters of Marx, writes of the 7 moments or levers that keep global economies in place. But many of the levers he speaks of can be modified to look at social ecological systems as well. So we know, for instance, that institutions, technology, and the way people engage with natural resources are critical to how shared social ecological systems are shaped. But there are a host of other factors that influence how humans dialectically modify ecological dynamics. These include, our attitudes to nature, daily life, social relationships, our mental conceptions, how we make sense of the world. All of these together, I think, interact in really complex ways within many of our systems. And I think that we need to understand that, okay, before we know exactly how our systems need to be modified, or if they need to be modified at all. I don't think this is the field of a single intellectual field. I think it requires thinkers from a variety of epistemic backgrounds to contribute to our understanding of social ecological systems. Most importantly, I think this entire social ecological system is set firmly in the history and geography of place. What this suggests is that every geography has its very own unique social ecology, one that is strongly influenced by the particular and the contingent history of that particular place. So that's a bit of a bold statement, because based on that, if you look at the conservation toolbox that we talked before, if what I suggest is true, it will mean that we need to look at this conservation toolbox quite carefully. Most of these ideas, okay, and approaches are Platonic in ideal, by which I mean that they come from a sense of being, universal, non-contingent, that they work pretty much everywhere, okay, and that they are true here as they will be in Europe, as they will be everywhere else, okay. So I understand completely the philosophy that underpins many of these approaches. The scale of the problem is global, and so our responses need to be equally ambitious, they need to be equally coherent, and they need to be equally global in their scope and their direction. However, if what predominantly governs our systems is completely locally contingent, and if it varies with geography, if it varies with history and with culture, it frustrates this universalizing project. If theoretically the search for the globally consistent is futile, our rummaging for global solutions may also be. Okay, if not futile, at least not very effective. So if I speak today to people in Lakshadweep, the catastrophic picture I painted of the reefs and islands is not front and center in their lives at all. The people of Lakshadweep are among the most educated people in the country. So, of course, many have heard of climate change. But for them, they are more likely to link climate change with images of polar bears on melting ice caps than to the crumbling reefs around them. Right? At the scale of human life, climate change is hardly the most important issue. At first, this blind spot surprised me. How could it possibly be that a society that is so surrounded by the self-evident crisis be so oblivious to it? But start listening to the community about what actually affects their lives. And a completely different picture starts emerging. They will talk to you about fresh water. They'll talk to you about the fears for how these stores will survive into the future, about fresh water itself. They'll talk to you about health, okay, particularly the health of the old and the health of women. They'll talk to you about their autonomy and their ability to take control of their lives. Okay? So very rarely will climate change ever be part of the discussion, but it is the hyper-object that is invisibly present in all of these discussions. Right? Their concerns are not drawn from any universal understanding of how ecosystems function, but they are existential and they are real. Okay? And they're very, very local. What is true of the Lakshadweep is probably not true of any other place. Okay? And in this space, I think, is where solutions suggest themselves. And they offer much, much more creative possibilities than our crisis toolbox can ever allow. So the ancient Romans believed in two types of gods. You had these mighty universal gods, that governed all the big things. You have Jupiter and Apollo and all these other big gods, right? But at the level of every local region, in towns and in villages, those Titan gods had very little influence. Okay, here at more human scales, there were other forces that were overridingly important. These were the genie loci. Or the genius of the place. Okay, and that's not something unique to the Romans. The Greeks had their daemons, and every village and forest in India has its own spirit force. Right, the genius of the place represents for me the inherent wisdom and knowledge that every geography carries with it. Every genius speaks with a local dialect, a kind of vernacular that is completely off that location. I think engaging with the genius of that place requires us to understand and to speak in its particular vernacular. So what I'm proposing is that we look beyond our universal toolbox and reframe conservation as a more vernacular discipline, one that is rooted in local ecology, local society, and local practice. So I'm borrowing the idea of the vernacular. The idea of the vernacular is not new. Okay, it has existed from at least 1960s in architecture, where it talks about a form of locally appropriate building that uses traditional materials and ideas. More critically, the vernacular is uninfluenced by formal intellectual trends in architectural thought. It's completely off the place, not drawn from any larger intellectual tradition. And I think that if we modify the principal philosophy of vernacular architecture, it suits very well what I want to propose here. Vernacular conservation is a conservation of the people and by the people, but not for the people. Okay. I'll admit that I have thought about this like this, but I've never not done it myself. Okay, I have been too dazzled by the universal narratives of crisis, and all the work of our group has been about documenting this crisis. We are only making our first baby steps about what a more vernacular approach would look like. And after more than 25 years, we have only now begun to listen. Okay. So then here are my two big takeaways. First, we need to modify our expectations and give up on dreams of Eden. We need to give ourselves time, plenty of time. My suggestion is 30 years, around 10 times more than most project cycles. Why 30 years? Well, because 30 years is a single human generation. it probably is the time for it probably is the time that societies take to change. It's for the old patriarchs to die, right? And for a new breed of thinkers and managers to take over. If we need our moribund institutions and toxic marketplaces to change, it will need time. It takes a generation to change attitudes. 30 years also matches much better the scales at which most of our ecosystems work. Okay, they work at those longer time scales. Second, we need to be wary of universal, essentialist solutions to the conservation crisis. Embracing the vernacular requires conservation and conservation science and practice to be locally embedded and long-term. It needs to arise from the concerns and preoccupations that arise from these local geographies. This will mean, I think, rethinking how we frame our questions, for how we conduct ourselves with local communities, for how we raise money and deploy it. I think it'll also mean rethinking what success looks like in many of our ecosystems. As we move forward, it may be useful to ask ourselves if we have the required skills and the imagination to be instruments of long-term change.